Support comes from the Rosa Parks Museum on Troy University's Montgomery campus. Located on the spot of Mrs. Parks' historic 1955 arrest and featuring exhibits that chronicle the history of the Montgomery bus boycott. More information at troy.edu/Rosa Parks.
From Troy Public Radio, Troy University, and the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama, this is It Came from the Archives. I'm Greg Phillips. Each episode, we delve into the archives to bring you a topic, introduce you to someone new, or tell you a story about the Wiregrass region and the surrounding area. Our guide is Marty Olaf, director of the Wiregrass Archives at Troy University. You're listening to the unmistakable sound of a sacred harp or shaped note choir. Sacred harp choirs often gathered at singing conventions that were held throughout the South in the 19th and into the 20th century. Our conversation today centers around one such convention at the 1949 Houston County Fair. Our guide to the Wiregrass Archives, Dr. Marty Olaf, is here to tell us all about it.
Greg, it's nice to be here, and thank you for having me, and thank you, listeners, for listening in. And I hope that you learned something today that you didn't know before. I want to start out by talking about why we're talking about this. One of the things that happens in an archives is somebody will find something in their parents' collection, or they'll run across something at a flea market or something like that piques their interest, that's from the past, that's from the area, and they'll say, wait a minute, I know that this might be important for the Wiregrass Archives and for the history of the Wiregrass. And so people will contact me. Sometimes there's a large body of material that they want to donate, but in this particular case, it was one item, one brochure called the Souvenir Edition 10th Annual Frank Stamps Houston County Fair Singing Convention. Just a little booklet. And that was donated quite kindly by a Mr. Mark Willis, who had discovered this while going through his parents' papers, after they had passed away.
This is an interesting situation here, because you get this new bit of information. And this one actually is a program that took place at the Houston County Fair.
Right. Houston County Fair. There's a long tradition in more highly rural areas in the U.S. of people gathering together to sing. There's also a tradition that goes back way into the early 19th century, the late 18th century, of having fairs, particularly for agricultural products. And then, by the middle of the 19th century, that switched over to enormous fairs for industrial products, like the World's Fairs.
Right.
But, in smaller, more agricultural areas, the county fair ran for years and years and years. Just about every county has one. It focuses on agriculture. We still do a lot of that now, like at the Peanut Festival. There are a couple of agricultural days, and agricultural products are displayed. But at the Houston County Fairs, for a long, long time, and which was not uncommon, they also featured community singings. A singing convention was what it was called. And this was also something that had been taking place because of the needs of commerce. Before record players, before mixtapes, before cassettes, I'm saying things that a lot of people don't necessarily know anything about, before CDs, before streaming, before you had playlists. The way that people made money off of music, commercial vendors, was to sell song sheets, written music. That's the only commercially viable product there. So there were a lot of commercial publishers for music, and they all vied with each other to sell as many copies of the sheets as they could. So these singing conventions started out as church events, started out as community events. They were formerly called schools when they were held at churches. And they were closely associated beginning with the old shaped note and sacred harp traditions that came from the 15th and 16th centuries, primarily in England, and other sacred music traditions because they were done at churches. Now, you know of shaped note singing. A lot of people who are listening to this have heard shaped note singing in one form or another. And
we just don't know what it's called.
yeah. Shaped note or sacred harp singing. You've heard it if you've seen the movie Cold Mountain.
Right.
It's that kind of haunting music that the church congregation is doing. And the way they do that music is very cool. That still goes on today. There's still a pretty robust sacred harp shaped note group on Sand Mountain in North Alabama that has a convention every year in Montgomery. They do that in February, and frequently they do it in the auditorium of the Capitol building, the old Capitol building that's now a museum with a few executive offices in it. They gather there, they have these shaped note sings, very reminiscent of the community and church shaped note singing. A lot of times a so-called professor of music would announce that he, is always a he, would show up in an area, and they often represented these sheet music publishers. They'd hold a multi-day gathering at churches. This is in addition to the congregations doing this themselves. They taught children how to sing during the day, and then in the evenings, every evening while they were there, they'd hold a community singing. The so-called 5 and 7 note scales tended to predominate these sings, and shape note, however, relies on 4 syllables, fa, sol, la, and mi. I know nothing about music. I don't understand the difference in a 7 and a 5 note scale and the fa, sol, la, 4-syllable scale. And then what replaced that is what we understand and what my piano teacher was so frustrated at me for never really getting was the 8-note octave. That and round notes have replaced this older shaped note singing, and they call it shaped note because the different syllables, fa, sol, la, and mi, are represented on the musical scale by a triangle, an oval, a square, and a diamond. So it's not so much the position of what line or space they're on in the clef. It's also the way the note looks, so you know what syllable you're singing. And of course, you're not singing the syllable itself, you're singing the tone of that syllable. So it's also pretty cool the way that shape note and sacred harp singers do this. They stand in an open square facing in. One of their number becomes the leader. You know, if they don't have a professor there, one of the number becomes a leader. They choose the song. They choose the scale. They sing the first note. And a lot of times they'll sing a couple of lines and to warm up. You know, they'll sing a bar of the words, of the lyrics, and then it's like call and response. Then the choir will sing that back. And then finally, when everybody's warmed up to all of the musical intonations that the leader's after, they'll sing the whole thing. And it's not really melodic, and it's very rhythmic, almost like a sing-song recitation of whatever they're singing, which is usually some kind of sacred music.
It's an interesting setup, the square around, because you're used to kind of a person standing in front, and then there's maybe a semicircle that they're singing in front of, and this is, you know, all kind of singing at each other. It's kind of an interesting change.
Definitely singing at each other. And then a new leader will come forward with every song, and then they can change. It took a lot of effort and a lot of skill to be able to do this effectively. I'm sure that there were people like me that just, you know, mouthed the words and didn't, you know, in sacred music, there's that idea of making a joyful noise unto the Lord. And I'm afraid that I'm very much part of that noise process.
We've always been there. We've all been there before. Of the when you're sitting there and you're like, is this really going to be a praiseworthy situation? You know?
Yeah. This was really common in rural churches, and it was very common among primitive Baptists.
When did this change happen? When did it move from shaped note into what we eventually became familiar with?
With the move of people from the countryside into town, which does not necessarily mean, Alabama didn't become an urban state where a majority of people lived in a city until the 1950s. But we're not talking about that necessarily. We're talking about the urbanification, you might say, of the culture, where towns became more important, where people weren't restricted because of transportation difficulties to just within a few miles of their house. We're really talking about the advent of small towns being close together and the advent of the automobile. Think about this. Before the automobile, people lived their lives at 3 miles an hour. That's as fast as you could walk comfortably for any length of time, and it's as fast as a mule or a horse would draw your wagon, 3 miles an hour, if you wanted to do any kind of extended moving. Bicycles jacked that up to about 12 miles an hour, but you had to have good roads. The railroad jacked that up to 25 miles an hour, but how many people actually got a chance to ride the rails? But the automobile, that changed. And those became cheap enough that many people in rural America and rural Alabama could buy a used automobile, even if they couldn't buy a new one. The cost of a 1908, brand new 1908 Ford Model T, which is really the car that changed how America dealt with automobiles, was about $850 in current terms. It wasn't the cheapest car, but it was one of the most reliable for rural driving. And that changed how America dealt with things. So people began moving into towns, they began coming into towns, and once this happened, they began forming singing associations, and they held conventions. Some of these communities held weekly or monthly sings with dinner on the grounds. That's reminiscent of what you would do at church, what their parents did, what their grandparents had done. And some of these associations held large annual rallies that were headlined by entertainers. One of the things that switched the musical style from shaped note and sacred harp and other versions of sacred music was the success of that 8-note scale that I talked about because of the advent of radio and with the invention of gospel music after World War I. Gospel music is a particular kind of music. It's like saying the blues. It's a particular kind of music. And that was invented in the immediate aftermath of World War I, just a little bit after the blues, and it takes some of the blues traditions with it. That helped popularize that 8-note round note scale, just like the advent of radio did.
One of the aspects in your article, as an example of the importance of these events and how popular they were, is a newspaper out of Walker County having an announcement of one of these professors that you were referring to visiting.
Right. And the interesting thing here is that it's a segue into the brochure that we received, the souvenir edition of the 10th Annual Frank Stamps Houston County Fair Singing Convention. What they were announcing in Walker County at a little town called Bestville at Northside Church in Bestville, Alabama, up in Walker County, which is where Jasper is.
I was going to say, as town names go, I mean, Bestville is pretty great. I would totally come up with that if they were today.
Yeah, Bestville, excellent town name. They held Friday night singings, and the newspaper excitedly announced, quote, that Professor Eugene Wright was with us with a supply of the new Stamps books. So people were waiting for another edition of this particular group of singers and publishers of these songbooks. They were waiting on them to come out. This was in June of 1937. Now, a month before that, in May of 1937, to give you another idea of what's going on here, Dothan hosted the Tri-State Singing Convention in its then new armory and had a seating capacity of 4,500, which it filled. But the interesting thing here is the publishing company quartets. The publishing business had evolved from professors only going out and distributing and selling copies of sheet music. That's what Professor Eugene Wright was doing in June of 37. But what was going on in the Tri-State Singing Convention in Dothan of May of 37 was another avenue of business in which publishing companies hired quartets to go out and sing their songs from their songbooks and sell the songbooks while they were out there.
And this ties into the stamps book that you mentioned earlier. We're not talking about a book of stamps. We're talking about a family that actually, or two brothers, that actually made quite an impact in the singing of the era.
They really did. This is a pair of brothers, V.O., I don't know what his first name is, Stamps, and his brother Frank Stamps. They're from Texas. They began in the music business during World War I. Frank formed in 1920 the Stamps Quartet, named for the family, that was wildly popular, and he promoted sheet music sales for what was called the Vaughn Company. So the Stamps Quartet would book in locations. They would go and they'd sing from the Vaughn Company sheet music, and then of course they would sell it as what we would call now merch. Instead of T-shirts and CDs and stuff like that, they'd sell the sheet music. For his part, brother V.O. Stamps formed the Stamps Company in 1924, then expanded that in 1926 as a music publishing company, and he sent quartets out under varying names and members throughout all of the South. So you might see the V.O. Stamps Quartet, which in one location would have these four members, but in another location, still the V.O. Stamps Quartet, would be completely different bunch of people. And a lot of times they'd hire one local person to sing with them, and that would draw in some local support. So one of the quartet members would be a local person who was featured.
Wow. Because
they were known as a singer, and they could draw in the locals, family members, extended family members, friends.
all with the idea of selling this sheet music.
Absolutely, all with the idea of selling a sheet music. Now, Frank and V.O., they didn't really part ways, but they moved in slightly different directions. Frank started his Frank Stamps All-Star Quartet, which produced the first major hit for Southern gospel on the radio, called Give the World a Smile in 1927. They sold 500,000 records of Give the World a Smile in 1927 on the Victor label that was associated with RCA. Label. The All-Stars disbanded during the Great Depression, but in 1935, they reformed and they began a 25-year slot on a Dallas radio station, KRLD.
So this music that sort of took off in the 1920s, they're still singing it in 1960 after the advent of rock and roll.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow. Rock and roll was very controversial, very contentious, especially in the white community. You know, a lot of people consider it to be black music. You know, a lot of black people now consider it to be black music that white people expropriated, and to some extent that's true. But a lot of highly religious folks, both black and white, consider it to be the devil's music. So yeah, gospel music and religious music and sacred music continued to have and continues to have a very large body of listeners who are not doing it as a trend or as a style. There's a long history of this multi-generational listening audience for this kind of music. Poor old V.O., though, he died in 1940 unexpectedly. So Frank, V.O. had booked a bunch of gigs for his quartet and had a bunch of sales that he needed to do. And he had booked all of this stuff up. He had made all these contracts. And then he died unexpectedly. Well, the company still has to honor these contracts. So Frank stepped in. He took over VO's role with what then was called the Stamps Baxter Music Company. But he also took over all of VO's concert commitments. One of those was the first Stamps Quartet appearance at the Houston County, Alabama Fair. The local organizers, which in 1939 were Louis Opert, Harvey Etheridge, and the L.G. Lunsford family, turned the first day of that fair over to the Frank Stamps Quartet for a singing convention, and that tradition continued for over a decade.
1949, this is where the 1949 of it all comes in. We have the Houston County Fair, and this is one of those gigs. The Stamps, Frank Stamps comes to town or brings this act to town and exposes it to the people of Houston County.
Yeah, and just like in the previous decade, the first day of the Houston County Fair was turned over to the Frank Stamps Houston County Fair Singing Convention, where souvenir edition songbooks were available for 50 cents, which I'm sure is why we ended up with one of them, was that Mark Willis's parents were there and they bought one of these books for half a buck. This featured a story of the convention, which is where we've gotten this information from, and blurbs about the 5 Stamps quartets from the region. There were 5 of these quartets, and nobody said, "Oh, that's the fake Beatles," or that's not Beyonce. Nope, they said, "Hey, the Stamps Quartet, they're all singing out of the same songbook. Let's go listen to all of them." And one of the images inside of the souvenir edition shows one of the quartets, and it's the original Stamps, quote-unquote original Stamps Quartet. It's the one that's been showing up for the past 10 years to Houston County, and they call themselves the Old Gentlemen, and it's great. It's great. These guys are, they're in their 50s, possibly in their 60s, and they've been singing this music pretty much all their lives. At this singing convention in 1949, the first day of the Houston County Fair, the sing-alongs, community sing-alongs included 40 songs, many of which were published by the Stamps Music Company. One of these was "What a Savior." You can see the gospel flavor here. "What a Savior." And they had shape notes in this version of it, 1948 version. Another was "When God's Chariot Comes." Another, and you can see the transition to a more modern style of gospel music here, "Jesus is My Best Friend." And then they also sang "America, That Is My Country, 'Tis of Thee," "Amazing Grace," and "Just As I Am." So,
wow.
This is very Protestant, very non-liturgical church, very Baptist and Methodist and holiness and similar church music.
Was this a situation we talked about with the shape note singing, that it would often be sing-alongs? Was that the tradition here, or was this more of like what we would think of as a modern performance where they're singing to the audience?
Well, I think the way it's phrased, it's a little bit of both. But I think in this first day, particularly in the morning, it was community sing-alongs. And I suspect that they did both that semicircle audience around the quartet where they sang together, and I suspect they broke up into shape note groups as well. Maybe not everybody, but it was available if you wanted to do it, and it's entirely possible that the quartet would lead these shape note songs as well. But all I can say for sure is that some of these songs, "What a Savior" in particular, has shape notes in the staff as it was printed in the souvenir book.
It speaks also, I think, to the musical versatility, not just of these professional musicians, but also of the audience.
Exactly. The audience had to be very versatile musically as well, and actually skilled, and not just in being able to carry a tune. They had to know the different traditions of singing. And, seriously, we don't do this much anymore. I'm not a big nostalgia guy. As you know from our previous conversations, I'll say this, there's a literature on the difference in community involvement as it has evolved over the late 20th and into the early 21st century, and it is very different than community involvement. How many community sings outside of church do you go to? And I'm not just saying you, Greg, I'm saying the audience too. Think about how many of those you go to.
Right.
And it's a lot less than what your grandparents had available to them.
Absolutely. But this fair, the Houston County Fair, it involved more than just gospel singing. It also involved some other interesting attractions.
Yeah, it was much bigger than just the singing convention. It lasted for about a week, not just in 1949, but the tradition of the fair was to last 3 days to 1 week. In 1949 in particular, it had a midway that had 50 rides and sideshows from the Johnny J. Jones expositions. There were agricultural and industrial displays, and one of them was called, quote, a beautiful canned food exhibit.
Now, I have to stop you there because, again, me being me, that caught my eye because the idea of a beautiful canned foods exhibit had never really occurred to me before I read your article. So please enlighten the folks about what this canned food exhibit may have been.
Well, this is not professional canning. This is canning in jars. Whether it's in a can or a jar, if you process it, it's still called canning. And there's a long tradition going back to about 1911 with the development of girls' tomato canning clubs as part of agricultural extension work throughout the nation, in fact. And 1911 began in Alabama with agricultural extension work, girls' tomato canning clubs, and boys had corn clubs. They try to grow the largest corn, the most prolific corn, and the girls would can tomatoes. And from that tradition began the competitions for the best canned tomatoes and the best agricultural products. And then at agricultural fairs, whether they were at the state level or the regional level or the county level, there was always a lot of marketing involved. The idea wasn't just to can a bunch of your produce. It was to can enough for your family and then can some to sell. And part of selling is marketing. And these clubs were trying to teach young women and young men how to market their goods, how to make farms profitable, how to interact with the consumer economy that was coming in the 20th century. And so if you have an opportunity to look at photographs of county fairs or the Agricultural Extension Service photographs, particularly the home demonstration agent photographs in Alabama and in other states, you'll see that one of the displays that was common and constant were these multi-tiered displays on a tabletop of lined up canned goods. So the first layer might be tomatoes, and the second layer might be peaches, and the third layer would be something else, or maybe it was a whole table of one girls' canning club, tomato canning club product. So you see all of the jars of tomatoes that they had done. These things were very popular, very common, to show off the quality of your product and maybe market it to the people that were passing through that saw it, thought it would be luscious, and decided they had to have a jar.
Beautiful even.
Beautiful even.
So for all the parents that might be listening out here, the next time your children complain to you about how boring life is here in the 21st century, tell them that they could go and look at canned foods.
They could go and make canned foods
That too.
as well, but be careful how you do that because you don't want to get botulism. I hear that's just something that no one ever wants.
No one wants. That's not high on the list.
Right.
And the fair also had grandstand acts and twice daily shows from headliner Lou Childry of the Grand Ole Opry.
The Grand Ole Opry, yeah. So, I mean, the Dothan Houston County State Fair, County Fair, was a big deal.
Right. I mean, that caught my eye as well because the Grand Ole Opry, of course, was a huge deal. And to have somebody come to Dothan. And then this caught my eye as well because I recently saw for the second time the film Oppenheimer.
Yep.
So the wording of all of this being capped off by a display of, quote, atomic fireworks. I found that wording very interesting given the time frame.
think about when this is, 1949. Yes, things atomic were all the rage. If I remember correctly, this came out of a Dothan Eagle advertisement in the October 23rd, 1949 edition of the Eagle on page 1. And like I said, if I remember correctly, there is an illustration of an atomic bomb going off, that infamous mushroom cloud as an illustration. Remember, we had just convinced ourselves that we won the Second World War because we dropped 2 atomic bombs. There's a literature about whether this was necessary or not, but in 1949, that was not under dispute. We had demobilized. We were convinced as a nation that the atomic bombs had saved millions of lives, Japanese and American and many others, because it ended the war. We were the only nation that had detonated an atomic weapon, so we believed we were the only nation with an atomic weapon. It was only in late 1949 that the Soviet Union demonstrated that it had acquired atomic weapons. And as part of that, we ended up executing Julius and Ethel Rosenwald as atomic spies in I won't say 1950, but it might have been a little bit later, because we were so freaked out about the Soviets getting that. And then in 1950, China, communist China, Chairman Mao, got atomic weapons. And so by that time we were freaked out. But in 1949...
we had not yet gotten to the fear point.
We had not yet gotten to the fear point. We were still kind of reveling in the power of atomic weapons. And if you wanted a big boom, then you would go see fireworks that were called atomic fireworks.
When I first read it, I was like, I don't know if it would have been a good thing to have atomic fireworks in town.
Our idea of atomics now is very different than their idea of atomics then.
Tell us a little bit about Frank Stamps and how his great career wrapped up.
He continued touring until 1950, and then he switched over to publishing songbooks as his focus. He had kind of aged out of touring. Touring's hard. And he kind of aged out of it by 1950. He retired in 1962, and then in 1965, he died at the age of 68, still relatively young. He was born in 1903. But when he died, the Texas legislature passed a resolution to honor him as a, quote, outstanding man who brought joy and pleasure to so many through his great talents, unquote.
So we've reached the end of this episode, but definitely not the end of the Wiregrass Archives. There is still so much to discover and so many more stories to be told on this podcast. You can find more information on your own at troy.edu/wiregrassarchives. If you like this podcast, be sure to tell a friend, and we'd love it if you left a review in the App Store. That helps other people find this show. I'm Greg Phillips, joined as always by Marty Olaf, director of the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama. This episode was recorded in the studios of Troy Public Radio and was produced by Austin Toy and Joey Hudson with help from Kyle Gassett. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We'll be back again soon to tell you another story, and you'll know it came from the archives.